Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology, the Michael Lofton Show, talking about the question of did scribes alter the text of the Bible? There's a lot of ways in which we can tackle this question, but one of the reasons why this comes up is one of the things that we often explore on this channel are difficulties in the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, difficulties in the teaching authority in church history, and difficulties that we're seeing with the church taking place in real time, right now with various scandals and other difficult matters that sometimes cause people to kind of question things in the church. I've tackled this topic, this question of things going on in the teaching authority of the church, both presently and historically, numerous times here on this channel, in my lectures on the magisterium. I mean, my doctoral dissertation is very much related to the question, so it's an area of interest of mine, and I'm quite well known for tackling some of those questions and attempting to look at it from all angles, showing why some people have concerns and criticisms, but also why there might be some harmonizations and potential solutions to the tensions and difficulties, whether we're talking historically with papal infallibility or we're talking about today with what's going on in the church and what the Pope is saying versus what the Pope has previously said. And, some people make fun of that and they just call it Pope-splaining, right? That's where the term came from. Others just see it as a good faith attempt to offer some harmonizations while not shying away from difficult matters or ignoring the evidence and the data. But you know what? Believe it or not, the question of, Pope-splaining or magisterium-splaining or any attempt to kind of harmonize difficulties isn't really new. And that brings us to the topic of today. It's not new because guess what's been going on for several thousand years now? Bible-splaining. You could call it Bible-splaining, if you will, attempts to solve tensions within the biblical text, attempts to harmonize difficulties in the biblical text. Some have made, good faith attempts to harmonize them. Others just see this as delusional and you're just denying the inevitable. There's contradictions in the Bible, blah, blah, blah. We could have a discussion about inerrancy another time. The reason why I'm bringing this up is this idea of attempting to harmonize tensions is not something new to our day and age with the magisterium or with the church or even with church history, but it's something that goes back to the very beginning of the transmission of the biblical text, because from the very beginning there have been tensions within the biblical text. And I want to talk about some of those because, interestingly enough, some of the earliest scribes and the earliest manuscripts of the Bible that we have today, for the Old Testament, for example, but you could also say for the New, some of the earliest scribes saw some difficulties with the Old Testament text and also with the New. And what they did is they modified the text in some cases. They were Bible-splaining, if you will. They were attempting to harmonize and smooth out some difficulties found in the biblical text, things that they perceived as contradictions. They thought, wait, hold on, the biblical author here is contradicting himself because he says this here, but then he says that there, and so he's contradicting himself. Well, there must be an error here, so let's alter the text in an attempt to maybe harmonize it, because surely this is the original intention. Maybe there was some kind of corruption in the process, they thought, and so they just said, well, let's restore the text by maybe offering some kind of harmonization. And in doing so in the process, they offered some corruption to the text, at least in their copies, because in a good faith based attempt to harmonize the text, they're altering what was handed down to them and altering the text that they were copying. creating further difficulties and further corruption within the manuscript tradition. Later scribes would see that correction and then attempt to correct the correction. And sometimes they would get it right. Sometimes they would get it wrong and offer a correction that turned out to be another corruption. And it just led to a cascade of difficulties in the process of textual criticism that all textual critics are aware of today. And we could talk about that for hours. But my point is, these early scribes are seeing difficulties with the text and they're trying to smooth them out. They're trying to harmonize them. They're trying to avoid what they perceive to be a contradiction. Now, whether or not there was a contradiction, different question. In their mind, there was a contradiction. So they needed to fix it. And we're going to look at some cases of this. There's numerous examples that we can cover, but we're going to limit ourselves to specifically examples, and just a few, just a handful, of the Old Testament from the translators of the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek, the Septuagint. The Septuagint is that translation from the Hebrew text into the Greek language, maybe around 3rd century BC, right around there, carrying on into a few centuries after that. The Septuagint was the Old Testament, heavily quoted by the New Testament authors, as I pointed out in a stream the other day. But as I also noted, it wasn't the only thing that the New Testament authors quoted. They didn't just use the Septuagint, although that was the majority of what they used if they were quoting the Old Testament. Sometimes they quoted what's called the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text tradition, and sometimes they quoted something that's not available to us in anything. We have no manuscripts that reflect what some of the biblical authors quoted when they quoted an Old Testament text. We call these non-aligned texts. But the majority of the time it was the Septuagint, right? This was the translation that they often use when they're quoting the Old Testament. Now, the Septuagint translators, interestingly enough, there's this legend that there's 70 of these guys that Ptolemy commissioned all to individually translate the text into Greek, and they all individually, behind closed doors in separate rooms, all came out with the exact same translation, all 70 of them, and it's a miracle. This is likely a later legend, but that's the idea of the Septuagint and how it happened. Likely that's, again, not how it happened, but that's why you have the term Septuagint. It means 70 for the 70 translators. In reality, this was just a non-standardized text that took several centuries by many different translators, and these translations came to be known as the Septuagint. Be that as it may. The Septuagint translators, those who are translating the Hebrew text into Greek roughly around 3rd century BC and later, they came across some difficulties in the Hebrew text, what they perceived to be contradictions. And so in their translation, in their Greek translation, they started to alter the text in some cases to try to smooth out things and harmonize things and avoid attention, avoid difficulty. In the process, however, they may have been adding some corruption to the text. And so sometimes we have to compare what a scribe from the Septuagint tradition says versus maybe the Masoretic text or a non-aligned text. I want to give you a few examples of this. But before I show them to you, because I'm going to bring them up on the screen and we're going to look at a few examples, I want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. If you appreciate the content of this channel, you know, I cover a wide range of topics, all sorts of stuff. If you appreciate it, you like the fact that I have one day I'm covering commentary on what's going on in the news. The next day I'm covering some archaeological issue or some historical matter or biblical matter or theological catechetical matter. You know, if you appreciate the stuff that I do, go ahead and do your part. Hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. I would really appreciate your support. I also want to remind you of something before I show you of some examples of these alterations that some of the Septuagint authors made. I want to remind you of something time sensitive because it takes place tomorrow. Tomorrow, I am delivering a lecture, really 3 lectures, on papal infallibility, what it is, What it isn't. Papal infallibility in church history, the first millennium, second millennium, and also challenges to papal infallibility, as well as some potential resolutions and responses to those challenges. It's going to be really fun. Whether you're Catholic or not, you're going to love it. You're going to enjoy this because I'm going to approach this from an objective perspective, just talking about the matter very objectively and showing how this came about, what its biblical roots are, what its historical roots are, and then some difficulties with it, along as some potential solutions. So whether you're Catholic or not, whether you're Christian or not, you're going to enjoy this if you want to try to understand the concept of papal infallibility a little bit better. What you'll do, though, is you'll go to rtcourses.com. R as in reason, T as in theology, courses.com. It's tomorrow. It's October 25th, 12 p.m. Central. Now, if you can't attend, that's fine. Once you purchase it, you'll always have access to it. But if you can attend tomorrow, you will have an opportunity after these lectures to ask me some questions, some live Q&A. So try to be there. Try to take advantage of that. But if you can't, that's fine. If you can't make it, go ahead and purchase access to it because you'll always have it. There's going to be a PowerPoint, study guide, downloadable audio, you name it, Q&A. And right now you're getting it at a discounted price because the lecture hasn't happened yet. So go to rtcourses.com and go ahead and reserve your spot for understanding papal infallibility right now. And once you do that, for today and tomorrow only, tomorrow will be the last day. Once you purchase it after checkout, then it will give you 30% off the Magisterial Studies program, which is already at a bundled and discounted price, but it'll give you another 30% off of that, which is my 30 lectures and 3 courses at the university level teaching what the magisterium is, the teaching authority of the church. So if you want to understand how Catholic teaching authority works, go ahead and take advantage of this opportunity now. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the question at hand here. I am going to share my screen, and I want you to follow along with me. I'm going to show you something from Peter Enns, who summarizes this very well for us instead of us spending hours here diving through manuscripts, which sometimes we do. We can take a B-cut and get a quick summary of some of these examples through a secondary source, through what Peter Enns wrote here in this book, which you can see right here. I'm going to pull up a copy of it, How the Bible Actually Works. Then he has this long pedantic subtitle in which I explain how an ancient, ambiguous, and diverse book leads us to wisdom rather than answers, and why that's great news. You ever read, a theological treatise from the 1800s or 1700s? They have these really long pedantic subtitles. That's what that reminds me of. Anyways, on page beginning 175, if you have a copy. If not, you can follow along with me on the screen. He gives us some examples of this where some of the scribes saw what they perceived to be contradictions in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew text. And so they tried to smooth out some of those tensions by altering the text. So he says, Jews living in the Greek period had similar challenges. They addressed those challenges in a number of ways, one of which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament called the Septuagint. Translations are great places for religious groups, ancient and modern, to introduce course correctives to some things that might cause embarrassment. Well, what are some examples? These are fascinating. Watch this. For example, Genesis 2:2 in Hebrew says that God finished the work of creation on the 7th day. So if you're looking at the Hebrew text, most likely the Masoretic tradition, you're going to probably encounter something that says God finished the work of creation on the 7th day. And he says, which if you think about it, suggests that God actually did some work on the 7th day and then took the afternoon off. But that would imply that God broke on page 1 of the Bible his own commandment to not do work on the Sabbath. You see the difficulty that they were encountering? They thought, wait, hold on. The Bible's contradicting itself here. Not supposed to work on the Sabbath, but God's working on the Sabbath. Well, there must be a corruption here. So let's alter the text. The Greek translators saw the problem and made a minor adjustment. He finished on the sixth day his works. So instead of saying on the seventh day he finished, they say he finished on the sixth day. Now God doesn't contradict himself. Problem solved, right? Not really. It just introduces another problem. You have the original difficulty. Now you have another difficulty with a corruption in the manuscript tradition. So two problems now. But they felt that they were, kind of Bible-splaining it. They were harmonizing things. They thought they were doing the right thing by doing this. That's why in some translations of the Old Testament that you can find in English, some will say he finished on the seventh day. Others will say he finished on the sixth. That's what's going on. They're looking at the Septuagint tradition versus the Masoretic text tradition. The Hebrew word for a sacrificial altar, mitzbeach, is used pretty much across the board in the Old Testament, no matter whose altar it is, whether it's a pagan altar, whether it's an altar for Yahweh, they use that text. The Greek translators, however, they like to use two different terms to distinguish between pagan altars and altars for Yahweh. Let's go to the next page here. Let me pull it up. So they use different words depending on whether the altar was Israelite or pagan. That's a whole show in and of itself. Some of the pagan overlaps of the cultic system to Yahweh. Something we've explored already, but much more can be done there. That change helped clarify that sacrificing to God is nothing like sacrificing to other gods. Not a bad adjustment for Jews living in Greek polytheistic culture, trying to maintain their identity amid the temples and strange gods all around. In Hebrew, Exodus 24:10 says rather casually that Moses had a party of more than 70 Israelites, and they saw the God of Israel, which is a problem because no one is actually supposed to be able to see God according to the Bible. By the way, this is where you get the later essence and energies distinction in Eastern Orthodoxy and in the Eastern Christian tradition. They look at that biblical text and the tensions there, where it says Moses saw God face to face, but then it says that nobody can see God's face. Is there a contradiction there? One of the ways in which the Eastern tradition tried to account for that is making a distinction between seeing God's essence versus seeing God's energies or activities. And that's how they attempted to harmonize it. But that distinction that Callistus Ware notes is rooted in the biblical text, highlights this tension that we find in the Bible. Well, look, the Septuagint translators were aware of that. This didn't evade them. They saw this difficulty. So what did they do? The Greek translation shifts the focus, literally. They saw the place where the God of Israel stood. So they altered the text not to say that they saw the God of Israel. They changed that to say they saw the place where the God of Israel stood. So a little bit distant, a little bit more removed. They didn't see God. They saw the place where God was. Likewise, after instructions for building the mercy seat atop the Ark of the Covenant, God says, "There I will meet with you." Exodus 25:22. In the Septuagint, God says, "I will make myself known to you." There's a difference. I'll meet with you there versus I'll make myself known to you. This is actually a fundamental difference. The latter avoids the possibility of God physically appearing to Moses. So problem solved, right? No, not really. They're just introducing another problem into the manuscript tradition, and the original problem is still there. And in Numbers 3:16, where the Hebrew refers to God's very human-like mouth, the Greek translation replaces mouth with God's voice. So sometimes you have that anthropomorphic language use of God in the Old Testament. That didn't escape them. They saw that and they thought, wait, hold on. God doesn't have a mouth. So it must be referring to God's voice when it says mouth. So we'll just change it from mouth to voice. Now, that doesn't really solve the issue because voice still denotes something that is physical in nature. But it's a step removed from the physical aspect of the mouth. Yes, humans have voices too, but at least now God doesn't have a body. They reasoned. The Septuagint really wants to make God seem more, well, godlike in Genesis 6:6, which still troubles some readers today. Yahweh says he was sorry he created humans. Sounds weird, right? God was sorry? God repented? God changed his mind? It's odd. I thought that God knows everything, and how, if he knows everything, would he change his mind? Or how would he regret something or repent or be sorry? It grieved him to his heart because they kept sinning, which led God to drown everyone. How can someone the Jews claim to be the true God seem so indecisive? Not to mention prone to reactive human-like emotions. So the Greek translation simply gets rid of that idea altogether. Instead of being God, or instead of being sorry, the Lord thought deeply. Instead of grieving, he pondered. It's a nice attempt to solve the difficulty, but as I'm going to keep highlighting here, when you change the text, you're not solving the problem. You're just introducing a second problem. You're introducing a corruption into the manuscript tradition, and the original difficulty is still there in the text that you're copying. It's still there. It doesn't go away. And anybody else who has copies of that particular reading, they're still going to have it. So you're just adding more problems. But scribes didn't think that way. They just thought that, hey, I'm fixing the issue. This is how we got so many variants in some cases, not all. There's some variants that happened without the deliberate intention to change the text, but some of them were intentional in nature. And you can find it in the New Testament text, New Testament scribes. People were complaining that Christian scribes were altering the text all the time. Origen was complaining about it, and many others. Pagans and Christian alike were complaining that Christian scribes were altering the text all over the place. And the manuscript tradition shows that. Some are intentional, others are not. Was it out of a heart and a motivation of evil? No, they often thought that they were doing a service to the church by doing that. So if they came across something where Jesus says he doesn't know the day or the hour, they thought, well, Jesus is divine, so of course he knows the day and the hour of his return. So this must be a corruption in the text. So let me fix that. Let me take out this part where it says that the Son doesn't know the day or the hour. And they would just take it out of the text. But that didn't fix the issue because other texts still had it. And now these new texts don't. And so now you have different readings. That's what was going on here with these Septuagint authors or translators. Now God is in very Greek-like rational control of the whole process. Ends notes. God isn't taken off guard and doesn't change his mind. Just to make a point, apparently the ancient Israelites weren't bothered by Genesis 6:6, but we are. We should let that sink in, he says. Moving forward to the next page here. Christians today have perhaps more in common with Jews living in a Greek world than we would with the Israelites of the time of David and Solomon. We expect certain things of God and are bothered when we don't see them in the Bible. Likewise, according to Exodus 4:24, Yahweh is waiting for Moses by the side of the road to somewhat shockingly kill him when he had just gotten done convincing Moses to go back to Egypt and deliver the Israelite slaves. It's a fascinating part of the Old Testament. The Greek translation, however, clearly concerned with such a painful, ungodlike about face, says that the angel of the Lord was waiting for Moses. So they make a distinction between God and the angel of the Lord. Sure, that doesn't solve the problem entirely, but at least God has a buffer. These examples illustrate a vital concept for us. Jews at the time changed their sacred text to clarify, because a lot of these Septuagint translators were likely Jews. Jews at the time changed their sacred text to clarify in their time and place what God is like. They changed the Bible to accommodate their culture. Oh, that sounds familiar. I mean, we're seeing now some Catholic translations of the Bible removing homosexuality from the Bible, as I covered recently in a stream. Why would they do that? To accommodate the culture. All this reminds me of a recent controversy, he says, among some Christians, namely whether Bible translations today should use gender-inclusive language. Talk about a food fight. Whatever one might think of it, the argument that gender-inclusive language is simply compromising the Bible for the sake of culture rings rather hollow when we look at what Jews were doing about 2,300 years ago. They produced a culturally influenced Bible translation, the translation that, oh, sweet irony, became the Bible of the New Testament writers. That's a good point. Again, the New Testament writers were often citing the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew text, but not always, as I showed recently. But the bulk of it, Septuagint, and the bulk of the church fathers, at least the Greek-speaking ones, Septuagint. But the Septuagint contained these changes to accommodate the culture and to smooth out tensions in the text. The irony, right? Another way of handling different portions of the Bible was to interpret them in a creative manner called allegory. We actually see this with a lot of the church fathers, which is how sophisticated Greeks also handled their religious literature. Allegory is something of a mindset. It was thought that the true meaning of any literature worth reading lay beyond the literal meaning. You can actually see this distinction made in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It talks about the literal sense and then 3 other spiritual senses after that. Now, it notes that the spiritual sense is rooted in the literal sense, so it doesn't negate the literal sense. But it carries that idea of kind of allegorizing the text with typology and moral application. Lay beyond the literal surface meanings of mere words and took on philosophical or symbolic meaning. Continuing one more page. Some Jews, he says, applied this notion to their scriptures. God is infinite and not at all human, and so human words are not adequate for capturing what God is really like. The interpreter's job is to look beyond these mundane words to find the true spiritual message, submerged beneath a message about the virtuous and moral life. For example, according to one such interpretation, an interpreter named Philo, there is more to the burning bush incident in Exodus than meets the eye. This is where Moses first meets God, but Philo, in typical allegorical fashion, said that this was no direct encounter with God, since God should not be seeable, but with a go-between, an angel. That's an interesting point because one of the New Testament writers seems to indicate that. The Old Testament talks about the law of Moses being delivered by God to the children of Israel, or to Moses. But then the New Testament says actually there was a mediator, an angel delivered it. More important, the burning but not consumed bush wasn't really about God appearing to Moses in the desert. It has rather a spiritual meaning. It represents Israel's courageous survival amid terrible suffering, like enslavement. This is interesting because it's actually a concept that you'll find in figures like Origen, among others. Here's Origen's commentary on the Gospel of John. Look at this scripture this section about Scripture. Scripture contains many contradictions, Origen argues, and many statements which are not literally true, but must be read spiritually and mystically. And he has a whole long section about what he argues are contradictions in the Bible, but he smooths them over by saying, you know what? Yeah, the text on the surface is communicating falsehood, but there's a spiritual truth underneath it. That's how he attempts to deal with textual issues in the Gospels. He says the spiritual truth was often preserved, as one might say, in the material falsehood. He says sometimes the gospel authors introduced things that didn't actually happen. They introduced into the text things that didn't happen. Here he says, they proposed to speak the truth where it was possible, both materially and spiritually, and where this was not possible, it was their intention to prefer the spiritual to the material. He says, I do not condemn them if they even sometimes dealt freely with things which to the eye of history happened differently. So he says the gospel writers, sometimes they're writing things that didn't actually happen. And they changed them so as to subserve the mystical aims they had in view. So they changed what actually happened to serve this greater spiritual purpose, Origen argues. So as to speak of a thing which happened in a certain place as if it had happened in another, or of what took place at a certain time as if it had taken place at another time, and to introduce into what was spoken in a certain way some changes of their own. Now you might not accept his attempt to harmonize these difficulties, but this is the way that he and some other fathers attempted to deal with what they perceived to be contradictions in the Bible. They were very well aware of them. All in the New Testament, all in the Old Testament, the Bible is full of them. This isn't something new to our modern age. Fathers of the church were well aware. Sometimes they just said, I don't know, there's a contradiction here, but there must be a higher spiritual truth. Or others will say, well, maybe there's a corruption in the manuscript tradition here. Or others will say, maybe it looks like there's a contradiction, but really there is some kind of harmonization we're not perceiving at the moment. There's all sorts of ways in which they try to approach the question. But approach the question they nonetheless did. You may or may not accept their attempts at offering a solution, but these were some. So it wasn't just scribes that were aware of these things. It was commentators, commentaries, church fathers, ecclesiastical writers, bishops, theologians, numerous people. Anybody who's studying, for example, the synoptic gospels, well aware of the difficulties there. Speaking of, I'm going to have Mike Licona on the show soon, and Sean McDowell on the show soon. I just recently had John West on. Why do I bring these three gentlemen up? Because they all had a fascinating discussion that I highly recommend you watch on Sean McDowell's channel called, Is It Time to Rethink Biblical Inerrancy? A Much Needed Debate. It was one that I saw coming for a long time. But I had John West on a few months ago. Going to have Sean McDowell and Mike Licona on soon. Also Daryl Bach, by the way, as well as Bart Ehrman. Now, Mike Licona once debated Bart Ehrman on the question of inerrancy, but it seems that he's maybe somewhat modified his position. Mike Licona holds that there are some errors in the Bible. He just doesn't believe that they are materially significant to the message of the Bible. That's actually a very popular position in Catholicism. Whether you think that that's consistent with Catholicism or not, that's probably the most common position that you'll find in Catholicism, which is the idea that, well, in matters that pertain to salvation, there's no contradiction, but in anything else that doesn't pertain to salvation, there could be a contradiction or an error. John West, on the other hand, takes a different position, and he doesn't concede that there are any errors in the Bible. And he argues that, look, this is a slippery slope, because if the New Testament or even Old Testament authors are changing the text and committing errors, what else did they change that we're not aware of? Can we believe in their testimony to the resurrection? That's his argument. Watch the video. It's fascinating to see them go back and forth. Sean McDowell there in the middle, the son of Josh McDowell, is just simply hosting, so he doesn't weigh in. But you'll find it absolutely fascinating. In fact, let's watch just the very beginning of it, just a really quick highlight. Please let me know, by the way, if there's any difficulty in hearing the audio. Like I said, I'm going to have Mike on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it whenever he comes on.
Apologetic challenge about how we understand differences in the Gospels, and yet they intersect when we get to questions of what we mean the Bible is the Word of God, what we mean.
Just know, we're not dealing with contradictions. We're talking about a few things that Jesus said on the cross that actually, I think, fit together very well. One saying he cried out doesn't tell you exactly what he cried out.
Now that is a radically reworking of Jeremiah and Zechariah. If the gospel authors are willing to do that with scripture, then are we going to say that they couldn't do something like reshape Jesus' statement about into your hands I commit my spirit to?
Ooh.
It is finished.
Wow. Look, just to summarize that part, he's talking here about Matthew 27, where it quotes, or the author says he's quoting the prophet Jeremiah, but in reality, what he's quoting is not found in Jeremiah and in any one particular part. There's a story partly in one part of Jeremiah, another part that's another part of Jeremiah, and they're unrelated stories. And then there's another one that's actually, it's not even in Jeremiah, it's in Zechariah. But the gospel author says as if this is a quote of just Jeremiah. And it creates some significant difficulties. Some have attempted to harmonize it. Others say, look, there's just a mistake. The gospel writer made a mistake here. Lacona is saying he made a mistake, or maybe there's some kind of device going on there. But if he's willing to do that with Jeremiah, with the Old Testament text, then he might be willing to do that with the words of Jesus on the cross, or the I am statements, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, but none of the other gospels say this. People will be like, well, wait, if he claimed to be divine, or if he claimed all this stuff, why didn't the other gospel writers mention it? Well, Lacona is wanting to say, well, actually, Jesus never said those things. The gospel writer is saying that Jesus said it to communicate a truth that he did communicate elsewhere, just not in those words. That's the way he attempts to understand it. Others are just going to say, it's a contradiction. Others are just going to say, the gospel writer was making it up. Others are going to say, no, Jesus actually said it. And we don't know why the other gospel writers didn't mention it, but John mentions it. Right? So there's different views, different perspectives. But that's the conversation that they're having there. It's a fascinating back and forth that they're having. And I think there's a lot of application to discussions that are taking place right now between Catholics and Protestants, Protestants and Protestants, but also Christians and Jews and Christians and Muslims. There's a lot of application to that discussion and debate that they had. In all of those conversations, religious dialogue, apologetic conversations, you name it. It's fascinating. So go and watch it. Like I said, I'll have Lacona on. We'll talk about it more in detail then. But I hope I've maybe just given you a very basic overview to the question, but I hope I'm not giving you the impression that this was exhaustive in nature. This isn't even scratching the surface when it comes to scribal alterations. I did cover in a little bit more detail in a few lectures of mine at rtcourses.com, Encountering the Biblical Manuscripts, History, Transmission, and Challenges. And there I do talk about some more scribal alterations, some intentional, some unintentional. So maybe go and check that out if you want maybe a more thorough coverage to these things. But I do want to remind you again, Understanding Papal Infallibility lectures tomorrow. Go ahead and reserve your spot. tomorrow, 12 p.m. Central. Once you purchase it, you'll get 30% off my Magisterial Studies bundle. Take advantage of that phenomenal discount while you still have it. And again, if you can't attend tomorrow, the lecture, that's fine, fret not. Go ahead and reserve your spot anyway, because once you purchase it, if you can't attend, you'll still have access to the lecture at all time. And we'll discuss what papal infallibility is, what it isn't, its history, challenges, and potential solutions to the challenge. Whether you're Catholic or not, Eastern Orthodox or not, Protestant or not, doesn't matter what you are, you're going to absolutely enjoy it and benefit from it. So go ahead and reserve your spot, rtcourses.com. Everybody, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I would greatly appreciate your support of the channel. If you want to become a patron and get access to plenty of extra content, patron-only shows, patron-only weekly posts, patron Zoom meetings, you name it, go to patreon.com/reason and theology and go ahead and choose your tier and support level to support this channel and get access to those extra content. All right, that's going to do it for today. We'll see you tomorrow.